members that weren't able to make it, you can share the information with them. So I'm Sharon. I'm one of the founders of Executive Allies. We provide fractional CFO services and accounting services to small businesses, really with an aim to help them make the best strategic decisions going into their future, basing that on the historical accurate information. So today we have three really amazing panelists. Right here to my left is Brent Otkin. He's an EOS implementer and based out of Caldwell. He helps businesses gain operating system, otherwise known as EOS. That follows the Traction book, if you've been familiar with that. But it's a simple and proven framework to align leadership teams, drive accountability, and improve operational efficiency. He has a background in leading teams and building strong company culture. Brent is passionate about helping businesses scale with clarity and purpose. So let's welcome Brent. Woo! And then next we have Dustin Keys. Dustin is one of the founders of DK Constructors, and he founded DK Constructors in 2021 to meet the demand for a qualified general contractor focused on smaller scale commercial projects. So under his leadership, this company has grown to manage larger builds while maintaining its mission to build relationships, establish accountability, execute, and repeat, regardless of the project size. So let's welcome Dustin. And then lastly, we have Matt Christensen of Johnson & May. He's a construction attorney there, and he's a seasoned civil litigator and transactional attorney with deep experience in construction, commercial law, real estate, and franchising. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Idaho College of Law, and he brings a legal depth and practical insight to contractors looking to grow and protect their businesses. So let's give it up for Matt. So today we'll just have a conversation. We have some conversations that we'll start with, and then if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask, and then we'll open it up at the end for general questions to get started. But I'll let each of them tell a little bit more in-depth overview of who they are and why they're here. So let's start on the opposite side. Let's start with Matt.
You just want more about us? Is that what you're asking for now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've been practicing here in Idaho for about 20 years. My personal practice, I deal with construction companies. I also deal with other types of companies, mostly when they're struggling. So when they're having financial issues, we help advise them on restructuring some of their debts, collections if that's the issue. And so that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from today is, in growing your company, doing it in a way that's financially sound so that you don't end up in one of those situations.
Dustin Keys with DK Constructors. I've been in the construction industry for about 15, 16 years at this point. Worked for a top 400 GC in the US for almost 11 years, and fourth generation construction, but first in the commercial side of things. Got a degree in construction management from Boise State. We kind of focus on the smaller to mid-size construction projects in the valley, ton of TIs, remodels, and maintenance work, and then we've kind of started scaling to the point of having 5 superintendents where we can handle some of the larger projects as well. But we're a service in the valley we're a qualified GC, and we operate like a big GC, but we're able to take on the smaller projects as well.
Yeah, I work with leadership teams of small to medium-sized businesses, just help them really grow and get to the next level, really get kind of out of the chaos and the frustration to the point where they can just get a better handle on their business, they can execute well, they can achieve what they really want. And business is pretty simple, it's just not easy, and so we help them understand how to use the tools and the framework to actually just get what they want from their business.
Okay, so on that piece of getting what you want from your business, what have you seen in operations that has connected strong operations to an eventual successful company?
So typically what happens is when people are in business, they have a construction company or a trade company or whatever the business might be, and they have a desire and a dream to build that, and they're good at that, and it grows, and they get more people, and it grows, and then they're super frustrated, and they're trying to figure out how to keep it growing and how to maintain their life and just get back to things. And so what we found is that there's really just 6 key components to a business that if you'll just get those things right, everything else kind of falls into place. And unfortunately, we just don't train people on how to run a business successfully. We just kind of throw yourself in it and hope it works, and half the time it doesn't. And I guess we're fine with that, which I think is horrible. So what we want to do is really make sure that we understand how to run a business well and can get what we truly want. And so what I do with EOS, and just doesn't have to be EOS, it's just any business, there's these 6 components, and really getting clear about the vision of what you're trying to do, make sure you're in alignment with that. So often the organization, just the people in the organization are kind of at odds with each other. They're just fighting against each other and slowing things down. And so getting clear on the vision is a big part of that. Getting clear on the people that need to be in the organization. We always hear about right people, right seats, and yet we don't really know how to get right people, right seats. And so there's a really straightforward, simple way to make that happen. And that is really critical. If you don't have the right people, then everything else it's gonna be a lot harder to get anything else to work. And Dustin and I were talking earlier, and that's one of the things that he's really focusing on, is hyper-focusing, is getting the people right. And that's wise, because if you do that, everything else falls into place. You've got to have the data and really understand what's going on, and oftentimes we, as entrepreneurs, we just go by gut instinct, and we don't really understand the data well. So we don't have our financial data, which is a big problem. But we also don't have our operational data or just our activity-based data. We don't solve issues well. We usually put duct tape and bailing point on things and push it into next week, hoping that next week will be better, which it never is. We don't have good processes and systemization of the business. And then we also struggle with just execution and accountability and discipline. And so if we strengthen those 6 areas, everything else really falls into place.
Easy peasy, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I never said it was easy, I said it was simple.
Okay. Dustin, Brent just mentioned that you guys were talking about people, and you're getting really focused on determining what that looks like. Can you talk about that process and kind of how you're navigating through that right now?
Yeah, so when I worked at the really large general contractor where they did over $1 billion a year, one of the things that we constantly saw was, we need a new guy, let's hire somebody because we have the jobs. So we get somebody in the wrong seat, like Brent mentioned, and then they were stuck there for 5, 7, 10 years. And one of our biggest frustrations was, I'm running it as the project manager, but I'm running 7 to 8 jobs, and my superintendent's doing 25% of what he should be, and I'm filling in the gaps. So when we started DK, it started out with just me, Christian, and my wife, and we gradually said, okay, we're gonna need a superintendent, even though we know how to handle both PM and superintendent roles. So we hired the right people. We took a long time. We actually didn't hire our first employee until 9 months in. And from there, it was, okay, let's find the right fit. The dollar value that we're gonna pay them really doesn't matter as long as they're functional and they can do 99% of their role. And we established those roles and responsibilities, set the expectation of what we want you to handle on a day-to-day basis, and then work together as a team. From there, it's constant training. We do quarterly trainings along with quality control measures on site, and making sure that these individuals that are our superintendents, or the lifeblood of construction, are operating the way that we want them to do on the job. And then being very open and honest with them if they're not doing something the way that we expect or per the roles and responsibilities, that we get ahead of that. One of the reasons we've been able to scale the way it is we found the right employees, We've been able to train them. We do have a very young team. We've got 3 superintendents that are under 30 years old, which is a good and bad thing because they lack the overall experience that some of the older generation may have, but they also don't have some of the bad habits that have been ingrained in them. And even some of those guys that we hired from other companies say, hey, you may have done it this way previously, but as a small general contractor, subcontractors don't need us. We want them to work with us as a team, but as like a big GC, they can kind of force the subs to do whatever they need to do to get the job done. We're about building the relationship, finding the right subcontractors, and then working together to make sure that it's a win-win for everybody. And we get better numbers from subs because of that, because they know we're going to treat them fair, we're going to work with them, and then overall the projects end up having a better result.
So I like what you said there. I think a lot of times when we talk about right people, right seats, it's the people that are internally in our team, but it's not always just the people that are internally in our team. It's also, that can go as far as like clients and customers and vendors and the subcontractors that we work with. It's not just the people on our team, and so I think that's really valuable to take away from. So now, Brent also talked about processes, and so Matt, I'm going to ask you this first, but what do you see lands people in your office related to processes that maybe aren't set up well, that are causing them to have to see you? Because I think when we talked, you had said really your goal is to keep people out of your office, which is like a conflict of interest for you. But yeah, what do you think?
So the problems that I see mostly is financial issues, right, with the companies. And what I've found with a lot of small business owners, like they're really good at building something, or they're really good at cooking this type of food, right? And they're not so good at keeping track of everything else that's going on in the business. So that's why they hire a bookkeeper, that's why they hire staff to help manage some of those things. But the owner needs to keep an eye on that as well, right? Because the staff can come in and say, look, this is how we're doing, this is where our payables are. Okay, great, pay them. But if there's no sort of looking forward, looking ahead, like, okay, we've got all this work in the pipe right now, but what's coming down 6 months from now? The owner needs to stay on top of that. And so some of that's through just regular communication with your internal staff, if you have that internal staff that you've put in place. Some of that, one of the key things that Brent sort of promotes in his work with businesses is they call it a scorecard with data. It's a weekly meeting where you're looking at the important data for the company, and it's different company to company, right? So like with our firm runs on that same system, so our data is hours, the people have worked, how much has been billed this week, how much was billed last week, how much was collected, that sort of thing. With other companies, it's going to be different data, but keeping a finger on that pulse of, look, how's the company actually doing? When I deal with bankruptcy cases, we file a Chapter 11 for a company. There's reporting that they have to do every month, which you have to file with the court. It's a financial report of kind of how the business did that month. And I probably have 50% of the clients, when they have to start doing these reports for the court, they're like, oh, these reports are really great. I'm like, it's basically a profit and loss on the balance sheet that you're filing with the court, and this is the first time they've ever really reviewed that on a monthly basis. So reviewing that consistently and keeping an eye on it, producing the budget, having somebody that's actually monitoring the budget, hey, are we sticking to it, just all the things that like you'd think were pretty basic and simple, like Brent said, aren't always easy to actually put in place.
Yeah, so the consistency there and staying on top of it, I like what you said about keeping a pulse on the business. As accountants, we're always looking for those data points that are going to be the indicators that are going to tell us what to expect in the next few months versus always looking back to see, well, what went wrong 6 months ago? Well, it doesn't matter what went wrong 6 months ago. We are in our seat today in the present, so now how do we impact the next 6 months? So just kind of going back to processes and the operational structure, are there telltale signs that you see when people come to you that they're not being intentional with how they're growing, and they're just kind of winging it?
Not watching those reports, sorry, I'm going first. You go first. So not watching those reports, right? Again, for me, it's sort of financial issues, so when people start to struggle, they start looking at other sources of cash, right? How much of my 401k can I take out this month to help keep the business afloat? That's a red sign. They're talking to their accountant or their bookkeeper, hey, which bills do we have to pay this month and which ones can we wait a month and not really have probable? Does anybody know what a merchant cash advance loan is? They're called, they're known as MCA loans. They're horrible, right? They're payday loans for businesses. They give you can get cash in like hours from these people, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then they start pulling money every day out of your bank account, and you're repaying that cash in about 6 months. If you're at the point where you're looking at getting one of those, that's stop. Don't do it. You talked about like hiring your internal people. You need to have the external people on board too. You need to have the accountant that you're regularly talking to, financial advisor from a personal standpoint, but then also from a business standpoint, and an attorney, maybe an EOS implementer. But talking to those people and involving them before you've gone down that path of, well, my 401k is cashed out, so I can't touch anything there. I got the third loan on my house, and so I don't have the equity there anymore. Then it's, at a certain point, it's too late to lead out of that role that you put yourself in.
Yeah, so as the business is growing, like I was saying, you really start seeing that winging it stage is the business grows and everybody just starts working harder. You just kind of brute force it. You're just trying to make it happen and make everybody do a little bit more. And they were already overworked before. So when you start seeing people that are firefighting, especially if you wear the badge of, hey, I'm a firefighter, don't tell people that. That's not a thing to be proud about because that's just showing that I'm just not very good at managing my business and everything's crazy. And so same thing with being busy. They're always busy, but a lot of times it's just there's a lot of frustration. They like their business, they want to see it grow, but they're almost like close to burnout, and do they want to do it anymore? I had a client that I met with the team, and we went around the room to say, okay, what's your role in the business? The only person that knew their role was the finance lady, because nobody else wanted the finance lady. Sorry, but everybody else we just kind of help out wherever, and it was just chaos. And so when they finally started getting the roles figured out what was happening, they were able to uncover a bunch of people issues that they had that were pretty egregious, that was masked, and system issues and process issues and things like that. And so when you don't have that clarity and you don't have the system and then you don't know some of the bigger issues that are impacting you just don't have clarity on it. So I would say the winging it is common. Also, we don't, like I said earlier, we don't really train on how to run a business, and so we're just doing the best we can. So it's not like we're not trying really hard and working really hard. It's just we just don't do a great job in our society of helping business owners understand how to run a business well.
Now, Dustin, I don't know that you interact with many other contractors, but I know you've come from a background of different construction companies, and so when you went to build DK Constructors, what were some of the biggest things that when you started that you said, okay, this is what we're going to do with intentionality, and then on top of that, like, have you had the experience of other areas maybe like winging it and then taking a step back and saying, okay, what do we need to like self-correct here?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things coming from a big contractor is they've got all the money and the software and all the things in the world that they have at their fingertips. And one thing that we learned real fast was, let's try this system. Well, that system does certain things and it does certain things well, but then like we used a product that was more of a residential based project management software. over time, we saw a lot of problems that it was creating where we're doing part in the project management software and part on Excel and part all over the place. And finally, we came to the decision of right now is the time of, yes, there's a money investment in going with a product like Procore, but we became a lot more efficient by using that software very quickly. And we'd used it at our previous employer, so we knew, and a lot of the superintendents in the valley use the same program. So there was that benefit of adding the quality control and everything being in one place that was a huge benefit to us. So learning quickly of, okay, this isn't working, now how do we write it for the future so we're not having to continually get by instead of excel and keep moving forward in the direction that we wanted to go.
I love the iterative process that you go through and try something and then it doesn't work out, and then you try something again. I know when we were in the early years of our business of Executive Allies, we had a marketing strategy that was non-existent. And so we hired a friend of a friend to build a website and kind of had an idea of what we wanted to do. And we hired another marketing company to do some SEO on the back end, and that didn't really do what we wanted it to do. And so we terminated them and tried some other things. And then maybe 3 years later, we did a branding session, and we're like, oh, okay, that's what we need to be doing. And then from there, like, it was scary to spend the money at first, but man, do I wish we would have spent that in the first year versus waiting 3 years to then get on a focus track of what our marketing was going to look like. So that iterative process of trying something and failing, and then trying something again and then failing, and then actually biting the bullet and doing what you knew you probably should have done from the very beginning is not always fun. So Dustin, when we originally talked and met, you had made a comment about a system that you use, and when you talk about financial dashboards and keeping a pulse on the business, one of your perspectives that you take is a profit first perspective. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I've had quite a few conversations with people about them starting their business and getting going, and one of the best things that I think we did right off the bat is read a book called Profit First. And ultimately what it's doing is setting aside different buckets to put your money in. And as you guys can probably attest, one of the biggest things at the end of the year is if you're not paying attention to what you're going to be paying the tax man, that's going to bite you at the end. Because great, you're making a bunch of money, everything's going good, but then all of a sudden there's a big bill at the end of the year. So every check that we receive from an owner, we take a portion of the profit and we set it aside for taxes, and we try to be on the heavy end because hopefully at the end of the year we don't owe as much as what's in that pool, and then we can end up distributing that to wherever needs to be. So Profit First is something that I always recommend to people. It's been a huge benefit to us where we've never had to worry about at the end of the year whether we have enough money, and it's always been at a surplus of, okay, now we can write ourselves a bonus at the end of the year with the leftover, or we can redistribute that money back into the business where it needs to be. So that's been a huge benefit to us, is reading that book, and I'll tell everybody about that book. It's a great starting system, especially if you're not, like, we did a lot of accounting, and as a project manager, you tend to do all of the functions of construction. You bid it, you run the project, you do the accounting, but by setting those systems up ahead of time, it helps the process substantially.
Now, to layer on top of that, talking about what to expect for the future. So I know the tariff conversation has kind of been a little bit of a roller coaster, maybe a lot of a roller coaster, but it's been on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And so when we talk about planning, this will bring in some of the contracts too, but you know, there's material cost swings, and sometimes there's a project that's quoted and it doesn't actually start for 6 months. And so with the volatile costs of materials, potential for tariffs, how do you plan for that?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is just open communication with the owners, and setting the expectations of, hey, if you're gonna sign the contract now and you're okay with buying the materials up front, that's a good way of getting ahead of the game. Every owner is not gonna be in that position where they can say, let's spend a quarter of the contract value right up front and make sure everything's ordered and we're not gonna be affected by that. But having that conversation of just saying, hey, this may be something that changes, and documenting everything properly, making sure you have the initial quotes from the materials from your subcontractors, and letting them know ahead of time, hey, if there are cost increases, we need to get ahead of this immediately, talk to the owner, let them know what the implications are going to be, and then just kind of handling it on a case-to-case basis.
Okay, so I love that talking to owners is our first approach and making sure that that's verbally agreed to. Now, Matt, I'm sure you've seen where verbal agreements maybe fell apart or didn't go as planned. So what are your recommendations when it comes to making sure our contracts that we have in place are set up to memorialize those conversations and make sure that there's clarity there?
So usually, especially with a construction project, most of the time you're gonna have a written agreement. And so if you've got some sort of discussion or understanding with the owner, make sure that makes it into the written agreement. Because if it's just an oral contract, if you've got a written agreement and an oral agreement, the written agreement's gonna trump it. And if you've got some additional agreement with the owner, either prior to the written one being signed, make sure it gets in the written one. The written agreements almost always will have some clause that says that this can't be amended or whatever unless in writing agreed by both parties, right? So if you've got a written agreement, later something happens, and you talk to the owner and you're both on the same page, that's fine. That's not an agreement that's binding because the written agreement says it has to be in writing. Now, what's a writing, right? Can a text back and forth between the owner and the contractor work? Maybe, if we both agree to the terms in that text, but it's best to get it actually documented and get a hard signature from somebody else.
Does a thumbs up work? If somebody thumbs up the text?
I haven't had to test that, but I don't want to. And if, like in the case of like increased tariff costs or something like that, right? That's not something you wanna wait for and just hope that, hey, maybe later we'll be able to reach some agreement as tariff cost goes up. Build that into the contract, that hey, this is the contract price right now, which is based on this estimate, but it's not a, so every clause will have this like force majeure language, right? If some weird act of God happens that this contract's good. An increased tariff is not a force majeure, it's just not. And so if you need to build that into the contract, build some sort of adjustment mechanism into the contract that says, look, this price may increase depending on the increased price that these products are gonna cost, if you're not just buying them all up front, right? If you do that, great, you've locked it in. But if you can't, you need to build in some sort of adjustment mechanism in the contract itself so that you're not then having to go to that owner later and say, hey, by the way, I know this is what it was, but it's now costing me twice as much to get these products, and so we need to renegotiate this. The owner may say, no, this is what you said you built for, and that's what you gotta pay, and I don't care if you lose money. And then you're faced with walking off the job or whatever. So build some sort of mechanism in there if it's gonna be an issue.
Now, one thing I know that comes up frequently, and Dustin and Matt, this is probably for you, but a lot of times construction companies deal with lien releases, filing liens against companies. When that comes up, talking about processes again, are there processes or best practices that you can recommend for tracking that or making sure that that's followed up on?
Well, the best thing that we have in place is my wife doing that stuff, because she hounds subs, she's on top of the lien waivers. She's always got documentation on a spreadsheet a mile long of when the sub gives us a conditional lien waiver versus an unconditional, final lien waivers, and overall unconditional lien waivers. And it's one of the hardest things as a contractor to get from a subcontractor is once we pay them their final bill on a subcontract, trying to get them to give us that unconditional final. But that's where we built those relationships and where we use a lot of the same subcontractors is we can kind of use that as leverage on the next project too of, hey, I need your last unconditional on the last project before I pay you for this project. So keeping those documentation in line and making sure that everybody's getting those back to us. I mean, as most of the bankers in the room will know, they want to see those documents. And even if an owner is a one-off owner and they're paying for the project directly, we keep the same process and we track those lien waivers even if they're not requesting them from us, because overall it covers us on the back end.
Look, and I think the lien waivers are probably an easier thing to have a process for because of the funding, right? It's really easy to go to a subcontractor and say, I can't pay you until you give me this, until you get to the final one, and you're like, I don't care anymore, right? From a subcontractor perspective, the filing of liens, I think, is something that also needs to be tracked. Because the timing for that is strict. It's a 90 days after your last work, it has to be recorded. If it's not, you don't have a lien anymore. You can record all you want, but it's not valid. And so having some mechanism in place to track, okay, when did we stop doing work or delivering product? And we're getting close to that. I mean, I've had clients come into my office on day 89 saying, hey, we need to get this lien recorded. I'm like, unless you have all the information for me right now, it's not gonna happen. And then you just gotta breach contract against the contractor. And it's the contractor who probably hasn't paid you because they got paid by the owner. And so it's a circular thing. So having that process in place to know when is that 90 days and when's the 6 months after the 90 days. Because even if I report the lien, that doesn't automatically mean I'm gonna get paid. Most of the time it means I gotta go pursue a foreclosure with that lien later. And so having something in place to track those dates, make sure the information is provided, and getting them actually recorded is important. And I say if you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, being aware of the different timeframes for other jurisdictions. So in Idaho it's 90 days. I think in Oregon it's 75 days. So if you're thinking, well, it's just 90 days everywhere, you get to Oregon, you're too late. You lost the lien right just because you didn't step up. So understanding what those different timeframes are if you're operating in different states.
Now, this goes back to the process again, and Dustin, I liked how you said you do it even if it's not required, even if it's a direct pay owner, the process is still the same, and that way there's that consistency. You know, I know the majority of us probably now are in a different schedule, maybe a looser schedule because there's kids out of school, and so I know, I was talking to somebody the other day and they're like, I don't even know what day it is. I'm like, okay, gotta have a process that stays the same throughout the year, and then there's not as many hiccups, and so I think that translates into the business world where do the same thing every time, and that way there's not all these one-offs where we're making decisions to do things differently. Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things that we see often is process is often lacking. We just wing it. You were talking about winging it earlier. And so everything's kind of different and new every time. And so every job is how do we do this? Do we have to lead this one or whatever? And having a process and then having somebody that's accountable for that. So having somebody that owns that and make sure that thought process is being followed is super important. And we just oftentimes overlook that, especially when we're super busy and there's ambiguity about who really owns it. And if 5 people own it, nobody owns it. So you really have to have one person. You have one person, your wife in that case, that owns that process, owns making sure that happens. And so if that starts to fall down, we can quickly identify and fix that.
Yeah, and that's really important. You talked at the very beginning where you had somebody come in and they all did all the things. Everybody did something of everything. And then getting really specific on who has to do what, and then showing that ownership and accountability for that role. And that way there's clarity in the duties, clarity in who's doing what, is really helpful. Now, going back to the contracts, a lot of times construction companies, they'll just have a one size fits all, like here's the same contract that we use for all of our subcontractors, here's the same contract that we use for all of our clients. Is that the right thing to do, and what is a better way?
I mean, we've got a couple different things that we use. We've got what's called a master service agreement with some of our subcontractors, the ones that we use consistently, which is a very detailed, thorough contract. And then we write addendums to the master service agreement based off of the project details themselves. So keeping that consistent, and then we have what's called short form subcontracts as well, because last thing we want to do is a subcontractor has a $5,000 contract. We want all the details in there, but chances are they don't want to look through 27 pages of contracts either. So we keep it consistent based off of a dollar amount, that if it's under $5,000 we use the short form, or if it's over that amount we use the full contract. But we've had lawyers kind of go through the contracts and we make amendments to them, and it's one of the things that we check in on at the end of every year is, okay, did something bite us? And if it did, let's make this a working document and make that change so we're covering ourselves in the future.
That process for this type of company is probably the best, right? Because you're consistently dealing with the same parties. The project itself may change, but then that annual review that you talked about, hey, look, this paragraph gets changed every single time we send this to somebody. Maybe let's look at it and work out something new. There's always LegalZoom or AI contracts too. I always tell people I'm perfectly happy with you using AI or LegalZoom to create your contracts. It's fine, because you're gonna pay me more to fix the problem that you just created by using that contract than you would have to just have the contract drafted right the first time. And so I get paid more if you use them, so I use them more. And that's true. There's plenty of times where we've had people come in with contracts and it's like, where did this come from? I found it on the internet somewhere. And the other thing is there's plenty of good contracts on the internet. So like actual contracts that have been used for different building projects. If it's a publicly traded company, a lot of times you can find the actual contracts that they use on different various websites. And so sometimes people will pull one of those off, be like, hey, this looks good. Changes the names up, changes the dollar amounts, that's the contract we're using. But it is either way too much for what your project is, or you're using like a technology contract for a building project. There's different contracts for different projects, right? And so as a construction company, if you're consistently constructing the same sorts of things, having a master agreement like we talked about that just has an addendum for specifics of that thing is a great way to do it, because then you're familiar with the terms of the contract you're dealing with all the time. Your subcontractors become familiar with it. You know where those sort of pinch points are that you're going to have to negotiate a little bit on, and you become comfortable with it. But keeping that annual review in place is good, just to make sure you're staying on top of things. But sometimes there may be some change in a case from the Supreme Court or something that came down that really changes this aspect of the contract, and so we need to change it a little. So that's another thing the review is good for.
No, I really like that annual review process. I think anytime we have a process in place, it's good to take a step back every so often and say, is this still serving us how we intended it to serve us? And even evaluating that accountability chart to say, okay, are these people still truly accountable for what they said they're going to be accountable for? Okay, so now as we kind of wrap up this section of the discussion before we open it up for questions from the audience, what is one thing that every construction company can do today to better prepare for their growth while growing smartly and staying protected?
One of the things I think that we've been really successful on is knowing what we're good at and then knowing what someone else is really good at. We've kind of put those items that were not the best or we don't have focus, like BBSI for instance. We work with them on HR and payroll and workers' comp and safety. Some of those things that they're the best in the business at doing those items, so let them take that off of our plate so we then are doing what we're really good at. So outsourcing certain things, and Brent can attest to it, that being in the right seat of sometimes as a business owner you can't do everything, and you need to know what things you can hand off and what things you can't hand off, and find out what you're really good at, and that'll eventually make you scale as you're focusing on the right things.
Yeah, I would say really taking time as a business owner to step aside and step out of the business and really think. We don't value thinking work that much in our society. We really are doing, and so we're always throwing ourselves at problems and solving issues, and we're thinking in that. I get that, but just, you know, if I said, hey, go take an hour with half a day with a pad of paper and a pen and just think, how many of us would actually do that and not feel like we're not working? And yet that's some of the best work we can possibly do in our business. And so just getting away, thinking, and then really organizing, like you were talking about, getting the structure right. A lot of times we build our businesses around our people, thinking that's the best thing for our people, and it's actually the worst thing we can do for our people. We really need to have an understanding of what is the structure we need for this business to operate well. What do we want from each of these seats, and then bring the people in from that perspective. And I was with a client yesterday, and there was a big frustration that was starting to build, and one of the people that they were talking about, she thought she was doing a great job, and she was nailing it from what she thought the job was, and the owner was frustrated because she wasn't doing what she had in her mind what the job was. And so we went through and clarified what is the seat that she's in, and now they have clarity and alignment on that. So part of that is just getting aligned, thinking about the business, slowing down, and really working on getting the right people in the right seats. We often talk about communication and culture and that type of thing, and we try to play whack-a-mole to try to fix those things. Those are just symptoms. Those will happen when you get those 6 components I was telling you about. When you get those right, those naturally happen. You get the right people rowing in the right direction, things just start to settle into place and operate together.
I'll just add to both of them and expand a little bit on what Brent said. Sitting down and thinking long term, like where do I want this business to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and what's it going to take to get there? And then deciding, okay, do I have the people in place to do that? Do I need to add some more people? Do I need to outsource some more things? And just making sure you're finding the right resource to get you to that point. So I think there's plenty of businesses that are really good at operating in the today, right? Today or this year, this is our goal for this year. We want to do $10 million in business, right? Okay. But what do you want to do next year? What do you want to do 5 years from now? Do you want to retire at any point, or do you just want to keep making $10 million a year? And so having that sort of that long-term perspective and making sure you're putting plans and steps into place to get there as well, I think is important.
That has been one of my favorite things about the EOS process, is coming up with that 10-year vision of what the company actually looks like, and spending time thinking about what it will be and who do we want to be serving and how do we want to represent our company in the community, and writing it down on paper and then saying, okay, 5 years from now, where should we be to get that goal achieved? And then breaking it down, even like, okay, what is it today that I need to do in order to get on the path towards that goal? So we've loved working on the EOS program as well. Okay, so now I want to open it up for questions in the audience. If you have questions for Matt, Dustin, or Brent. Steve?
Matt, just a quick question on the tariff discussion we were having earlier as an example. So when you're looking at those contracts, are you putting just an open-ended to be negotiated, or are you seeing an actual percentage that's being floated around right now, up to 15%?
Pretty rarely are you going to have just to be negotiated, because that doesn't actually provide any solution, right? That's just, we're putting this off for another day, and hopefully it So, you can use the percentage like it, because the funny thing with the way tariffs work is what it eats into is your profit margin, right? And so just because this thing's gonna cost me an additional 10%, doesn't mean I'm losing 10% profit. I may only be losing 1% of profit based on this piece costing an extra 10%. So it's being capable of looking at, if there's an increase in the tariff on this project, how much is it gonna be, what's that gonna affect my bottom line? And that requires you to have a pretty good pulse on what that project cost is gonna be. And so then building into the contract, hey, look, as long as the increased cost is less than 5-10%, whatever it is, the contract's fine how it is. But if it reaches a certain percentage or above, then both parties agree that the contract price will be adjusted in some lockstep with that. And that's the approach that I think we're seeing most often right now. Some of it's just, like, I can't remember, we talked about like trying something, seeing if it works, and if it doesn't, try something different, right? That's what we're seeing right now. Maybe that's gonna work, maybe it won't. It just depends on how loud the tariff bounces end up being.
Thank you.
Questions?
Brent, what would you say, like, if you've got a business that you're starting to scale, starting to grow, and you're like, okay, we're getting past my capacity, when's a good time to start implementing EOS into the business?
Yeah, so businesses, as they start out, you're a solopreneur, you've got an idea, you're growing, you get a couple helpers and things like that, and you're still directing traffic, you're doing everything. When you finally get to that place where you're starting to then distribute the different parts of the business to other people, so somebody's overseeing finance, or somebody's overseeing the operations, or the sales, or what have you, then you want to start getting a system in place where you can unify everybody, get them harmonized and working together, and really starting to share the vision. When you're directing traffic and telling everybody what to do, you can hold the vision for yourself and just send people out on assignment, basically. But as you start to get other people owning, kind of quote unquote, owning the parts of the business, we need a shared vision. We need to make sure we're all on the same page with that. And that's where EOS really shines. So it's usually around 10, kind of the sweet spot for EOS tends to be that 10 to 250 employee range. Because you're at 10, you're starting to get into that place where you need that. Past 250, I mean, you can go past that. There's companies with 5,000 employees that run on. But then you start getting out of being entrepreneurial and become more bureaucratic, probably like you were talking about with your previous employer, where it's just corporate.
So I have a question to follow on with that. A lot of times we see companies come to us, and sometimes they run on EOS already, but sometimes they implement it while they're working with us, or maybe they don't. But one of the things that we see consistently is there's processes, but then the team maybe gravitates away from the processes. So how do you most successfully see companies hold people accountable to those processes?
To the core processes within the company. So what happens is we just naturally, things want to always kind of be great. We always fall back to the way we used to do things, or we don't stay focused. And so the best thing we can do is make sure our processes are accurate and make sure they're simplified, and then follow a process of making sure that they're followed by everybody. So I had a client recently that they were super frustrated. They have these processes. We've written all this stuff out. People aren't following it. We teach it when we hire them on, and then they're just not following it. And they were like, well, where are they? And this is the leadership team we're talking about. And so they had these processes. And she said, well, we've written them all out. And I said, well, is it an essay form? Is it like pages of stuff? And she's like, well, yeah, it's got all the information. I'm like, well, nobody's going to sit there and read that every day as they're trying to do their job. And so one of the things we talk about in EOS is you have to simplify the business. Processes is a good example of that. We're just simplifying the core processes, almost like a checklist. We were talking earlier about flying, and my brother's an airline pilot, and he follows a checklist every time he gets in the cockpit. He knows how to fly. He's not learning how to fly the plane, I hope, every time he gets in the cockpit. He's just making sure he does it the same way every time. And so the same thing with processes. You have to simplify those and utilize those and manage to them. Part of it is having your measurables based off of the process, so it ties back into it. And then also annually reviewing your processes to make sure that they're still relevant in that. So it takes leadership intent. And what I see oftentimes is leadership kind of gets bored, especially visionaries, that things are working really well. That's really boring for us as visionaries. We love it when it's working, but we don't want to be involved in it. Sometimes we want to go in and mess things up. We really need to get the right people that can make that happen. So it gets back to the people component, but they're all interrelated.
Okay, and then final question, this one's for Dustin. When we talk about the right people in the right seat and then tying that into process, do you have a process of how you evaluate your people and how you evaluate the subs that you work with?
Yeah, so to start with our employees, we've got roles and responsibilities. We do yearly evals as well, but ultimately what I've told all of our employees is when you come to us at the end of the year with your evals, I want you to have X amount of items ready to go to talk about of what you did for the year. Why did you hit all of the items that we expected or put on the quality control measures? And there's typically like 5 to 6 things that would say, okay, did you hit all of these first? Okay, great, you did everything that we expected you to do. Now you're asking for a raise. What did you do above and beyond that to say, I deserve this additional raise? And there's certain people that will come to you that are very good at it and say, hey, I did this, I brought this client in, I did this extra item, I helped implement this process. And that's pretty easy for me to sit there and look back and say, yeah, they excelled, they did more than what they were expected to do. And then at the same time, if someone isn't hitting all of those points, now it's how are we gonna get you to hitting all of those points? And next year is going to be a conversation of 2 years in a row, did you not meet the expectations? Then we have to have a deeper conversation at that point. But we're also have on a quarterly basis when we're doing our trainings, we leave the last end of the meeting open to what went well, what didn't go well. And I don't want to fix it at the end of the year. I want to fix it now versus let's wait 9 months until it gets to your eval. So what can we do better? How can we assess it? And then let's make those changes versus waiting on it to get the company to continue to perform better.
I was just gonna add, the fun conversations are the ones who aren't meeting the expectations, but are coming in to ask for a raise. And you gotta have a hard conversation.
That conversation feels easier though. Maybe not, okay. All right, well, one last call for questions
I
here.
have one along those same lines. So basically, if you have an employee or someone, a lot of times I see it in commercial banking, you see a client or a business start really small, and they grow to the next level. A lot of times they bring in family members to do the books, to do the accounting, that sort of thing. But as they grow, they kind of outpace that skill set level, right? And so they got to kind of level up the game. And that's probably, I think, one of the biggest challenges is firing your mom as a bookkeeper, or firing your wife as a, when really you need now maybe a controller, or maybe you're moving into a CFO position. So maybe each one of you can kind of talk about, hey, when's the right time, and how do you make that decision and delicately handle, that transition to that next level of skill set. If that makes sense.
Brent, do you wanna talk about your people analyzer tools?
Go for it. You had to do it.
So in the AOS system, they have a couple of tools. One, we kind of mentioned this right person, right seat thing. So there's a chart that they use where you list the values of the company. So these are the values that everybody shares. And then put the person's name on there and you go through each of those values, right? There's a voting scale, everybody on the leadership team votes and says it's either a plus minus, or a minus, right? A plus is, yes, they exhibit this value. Minus is, they don't, virtually never. Plus minus is, some of the time they do, most of the time they do, right? And then as a team, you've decided, hey, what's our standard? Do we want 100% pluses? Do we want, maybe you can have 1 plus minus, they're just having a bad week on this issue or whatever. And so we run through that system. And then there's a second component to it, which is GWC, do they get it? Do they understand what the job is? Do they want it? Do they want that job? And do they have the capacity for it? And can they do it? Even if they get it and they want it, but they just can't do it, right? And so on that scale, if they don't get it and they don't want it, that's sort of an automatic negative, right? They don't have the capacity. Capacity is something that maybe we could have the capacity if we give them a little more training, right? And so our system, which we don't always necessarily follow because we're not the best.
Again, with the processes.
We run through that process and then we're like, yeah, but this person really could do this, then we gotta fire this other person too, and it's gonna cost a problem. So, but generally we run through that, and there's times where everybody honestly evaluates and like, yeah, two of our values, they don't exhibit ever, and they're never going to. Well, then that's not the right person. And so, and the GWC is figuring out, are they in the right seat, right? Maybe they have every single one of our values, but they don't want this seat. Well, is there a different seat that we could move them to? So like with your example, you've got the mom who's been the bookkeeper forever. Realistically, you need to have a controller in there now. Maybe you can move the mom to a different seat, so it's not as weird when you have to be like, hey mom, you're fired. But hey mom, we want to shift you to more of a collections role. We're having trouble. We want you to track all these liens, and when we need to record liens, and that's the new function we're going to have for you. And she may love that because with family, it's kind of weird because maybe they understand that they're overwhelmed, but they don't want to disappoint you by coming and saying, hey, I don't think I can really do this. When in reality, you'd be like, sweet, at least we're both on the same page, right? So anyway, that's what we use, and I stole all of Brent's thunder, so I don't know what he's going to add to that.
So on our end, the biggest thing that we've implemented on that side is, one, my business partner deals with my wife. So there's that separation there. I mean, obviously, I've got certain parts and pieces where we have open conversations about things, but when it comes down to like the yearly eval and that kind of stuff, he's very open and honest with her, and we've had the conversation from the start that we run the business, you are an employee for us. As much as you want to see the company grow and you know the benefits of it, it's just being open with her and saying, okay, if something's not working, how do we adjust this? And Christian has those conversations, but I mean, we haven't had a ton of issue with that side of things, but I mean, we've done the A, B, and C role type of players, and understanding on our end, as we continue to grow, we've got the remodel, the maintenance side, and then we've got the new builds. Are we gonna put the B player on the new builds because they may not want that or even need that position? And we say, okay, they're really good at remodels, let's let them do the remodels. If they don't show, it's not that they're a bad employee or they're just in that position that we say, okay, they want to do this specific type of work, let's let them excel in what they do well, and then let's train the other employees they want to grow and they want to do the bigger projects, so let's let them do that. Where we continue to develop the B player and make him an A player, but in his realm of what is going to make the business successful, and also what he wants to do versus trying to force him into something that he's not going to do well, and it's going to end up being a bad position for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's great. Excellent job, Matt, on explaining the people analyzer. I would just add that you definitely need to have clarity on the accountability of the organization. What do you need in seats? And the organization, as you're scaling, is going to outpace the people in the organization. It's just, we've got to get our head wrapped around that and make sure that we're more concerned about what does the organization need. And if everybody's on board with making the organization great, those conversations are a lot easier. We have clarity about the seats of what we need and have that conversation. And maybe you can move them to a different seat and have those other things. That's fantastic. But sometimes you run into that where you have the right person, you love them, but just not in the right seat anymore. And if there's no other seat, you've got to make that change. Other times you have people who don't fit your values, but they're really good, and that's a different issue. And we call those terrorists. Basically, they are really productive, but they're just eating away at your organization. You've probably seen that happen a lot as well. A lot of times when we're growing, we're just adding people and not going slow, like we were talking about, of really getting the right people. We just need bodies, and we just, it's really damaging to the organization. So several tools and things that we use to really sidestep the emotion of those conversations to just get to the, what do we really agree upon, and then just what's the logical decision to make.
So I really liked, we use the same people analyzer tool internally, but one thing that's coming to my mind, and one thing that popped into my mind when Warren was asking the question of, a lot of times there's companies that we work with that have a bookkeeper that's a spouse, or that's a wife, or whoever, or a mom, or the family member, or even maybe they just have a bookkeeper that's been with them forever. A lot of times what we see on the accounting side is that person has been kind of stunted in their growth because they haven't had somebody to train them along the way. And so one of the things that we do as a part of our service is we actually train them to become elevated in the role that they need. And so then we'll mentor them through developing them into, maybe a staff accountant to now they're the controller, and then we can still serve as the CFO. So that way it kind of works for everybody, and we can be the bad guy when it comes to like, okay, hey, this is not how it should be done, this is how it needs to be done. So that's one thing that we actually mitigate through, and we've had fairly good success. We haven't had to fire any spouses yet. I would make that recommendation. But, okay, all right, well, thank you so much. Can we give it up for our panel today? Really good conversation. So if you have any interest in connecting with Matt, Brent, or Dustin, or myself, all of the QR codes for our contact information are up on the screen. And we'll all stick around for a little bit if you guys want to grab another coffee, another pastry, and just meet somebody new. Okay, thanks for being here.